Okay, so we're going to go over the last problem for Cartesian dualism, and then we're going to move on to behaviorism, give a short overview of what psychological or methodological behaviorism is. It was a big movement in psychology, basically dominated psychology in most departments in the world for, well, I don't know, maybe a half or three-quarters of a century. And then we'll move on to philosophical behaviorism, which is going to be our focus today. Okay, so just to remind ourselves, these are the four rough views of the mind that we're looking at in the unit. Dualism, behaviorism today, next week mind, brain, identity, and then we'll be moving on to functionalism. We have to finish off dualism today. So I had outlined the first problem for dualism, or the first version of one problem for dualism, the problem of interaction. And that was the problem raised by Elizabeth. Princess Elizabeth. Now, just as an aside, a little bit of background information, Descartes was actually, philosophers always have a hard time getting a job, as I know only too well. But Descartes also had a difficult time getting employment as a philosopher, and he was employed eventually as a tutor for Princess Elizabeth. But she lived in a cold, snowy place, and Descartes didn't really like the cold. And he also had to get up really early in the morning to instruct her, something like 5 o'clock in the morning. I mean, that's horrible in any case, right? And so he died after he was employed. He worked for a little while, but the cold and getting up in the morning didn't suit him, and so that was the end of Descartes. So that's just a little bit of an aside. We won't blame Elizabeth for killing Descartes, but she certainly did enough, and we should recognize this, to kill his view, right, with the problem of interaction. So the problem that we looked at is basically just this, that a causal relations, we've got these two distinct substances that Descartes is talking about, mental substance, physical substance. There's supposed to be interaction, causal interaction between them. It's not clear how that can happen because a causal relation requires some kind of interface that's going to connect the cause with the effect, the two relata in the causal relation. Now, Elizabeth assumes that the required interface is going to be something like spatial contact, which is an understandable view, because when we think about causation in simple terms like billiard balls crashing into each other, we think of surfaces coming into contact with other surfaces, transferring something like energy or momentum or whatever it is across that causal interface, and then the effect occurring. Okay, so she assumes that when an effect is going to be bodily motion, as it is for Descartes, but the cause is supposed to be the mind, there's got to be this spatial contact, but it seems like you can't have that if the mind is non-spatial. Remember, it doesn't have extension, so it's got totally different properties than mental substances or substance. Now, even if Elizabeth is wrong about the particular form that the causal interface has to have, so maybe she's wrong about it requiring spatial contact. There are other views of causation that don't require that. In any case, Descartes is going to need some transference from cause to effect. And given that he stipulates that mind and matter just don't have any properties in common, it's really difficult just structurally to see how he's going to be able to give us any story at all about that causal interaction, that causal interface. Okay, so that was the problem we looked at and we talked about in the tutorials as well. The second problem, or version of this problem of interaction I want to cover quickly today, just get it out of the way, is from Kim. It's the pairing problem. Okay, so here it is. Look, here's Billy and Susie. Let's call them Billy and Susie. Billy and Susie are usual suspects in the literature, the philosophical literature on causation. They're always throwing rocks at windows and bottles and various things. If you ever do a course or unit on the metaphysics of causation, you'll encounter Billy and Susie quite a lot. So here they are again, doing their usual thing, throwing rocks at windows. So Billy has a rock, he throws it, smashes the window, and Susie does the same. Now let's say Billy throws the rock and smashes the window in the science building, which is over here, and then Susie throws a rock and it smashes the window in, I don't know, the law building or whatever. Okay, so we might ask a very simple, I mean, this is a very basic question, so make sure you think about it properly. It's not convoluted or anything, it's incredibly simple. What principle governs the pairing of the right cause with the right effect? Think about what that question is asking. Imagine a Martian comes down, or some really dumb police officer comes along and says, I see there are 2 broken windows here, you're telling me that Billy and Susie were the ones who threw the rocks, and you were a witness to it. Let's say you were a witness to them doing this. The police officer might ask you, how do you know that Billy's rock broke the window in the science building and not the law building? You were a witness to this. What's your answer? I mean, how do you know? You saw them both. Billy threw the rock and it smashed the window in the science building. Susie threw the rock, smashed the window in the law building. And the police officer asks you, how do you know that it was Billy's rock that broke the window in the science building? I mean, you might think, wow, is this guy crazy? I mean, I was a witness. What more does he want? But like, think about how to specify it out in really childlike terms. How do you actually know that it was Billy's rock that broke the window in the science building? You don't know. You were there, you saw it, and yet you have no way of saying. Exactly. You saw the rock leave Billy's hand, fly through the air, come in contact with the window, and break. I mean, you don't normally have to explain these kinds of things to people, right? This is a really confused police officer, and he doesn't understand simple things like this, okay? So you look for this kind of thing, okay? You look for a causal chain, you look for spatio-temporal relations that explain how you pair up one of the causes. So you've got 2 causes here, Billy throwing a rock and Susie throwing a rock. You want to know how to pair up those causes with the respective effects. And you do that by saying, well, look, it was this causal relation in these, specified in these spatio-temporal terms that explains why it is that the rock that Billy threw broke the window in the science building. Incredibly simple stuff, okay? But now think about Descartes' causal interaction story. He thinks we're made up of a mind and a body that interact. Now imagine that you've got 2 exactly similar minds, boringly called M1 and M2, and 2 bodies, even more boringly called B1 and B2. Imagine being called B1, right? Your name is B1. Really? That's very interesting. Although it might be easier to pronounce than Oisin, so there's advantages as well. Okay, so you've got this, let's say M1 is the desire to kick the soccer ball into the goal. And M2, of course, exactly similar, the desire to kick the soccer ball into the goal. So that's a desire, it's a mental state, and it's supposed to then cause bodily action, namely the body actually leaping up in the air and kicking the ball into the goal. Okay, what's the principle here, like we were looking for in the case with Billy and Susie, that would enable us to pair up the right causes here, the 2 mental states, with their respective bodily effects? What principle could we use? So you said before that we would, in the case of Billy and Susie, we'd look for spatio-temporal relations, causal chain, something like that. Can we look for that here? I see somebody shaking their head at least, so saying no. If no, why not? Why couldn't you appeal to spatio-temporal relations?
Because minds don't have space, they don't take up space, that doesn't make sense.
Because, that's right, okay, good. So Descartes has already stipulated that minds don't take up space, so it can't be spatio-temporal relations. So it seems like we're in a bit of a quandary here. And the bottom line is that it ends up just being a total mystery. Which non-spatial relations could do the trick for immaterial minds? And remember, shrinking the point of interaction to just some small point in the pineal gland is not going to help, because it's still physical, it takes up space, and the pairing relation is going to still be from something that doesn't take up space, and you can't have spatiotemporal relations doing the job there. So that's the problem here. And it seems that without a solution to this problem, immaterial objects are going to be causally, minds, okay, Cartesian minds, are going to be causally isolated from their effects. They're just not going to have any way of, we've got no way of hooking them up with their supposed effects. Now, when we normally individuate physical objects, we do it roughly along these lines. We say that, look, physical objects, any physical object that occupies one and the same space at the same time, that's just the same object, okay? And similarly, material things exclude each other from occupying the same space at the same time. So I'm trying to get on the bus, it's full, you're standing on the bus just inside the door, and I say to myself, oh, perfect, I can just stand exactly where you're standing, right? That's not possible. The fact that you take up that physical space at that time excludes me from occupying that space at that time, the exact same space. So that's partly how we individuate physical objects. What we would need here to solve the pairing problem is some equivalent mental coordinate system for immaterial minds. So we would have to have something that was like spatiotemporal relations that allowed us to individuate minds and say how they, well, the second problem then is how we would connect that coordinate system up with our usual physical coordinate system. So we'd first of all, Descartes would have to have an analogous, non-physical, immaterial, mental coordinate system that's like, so it's analogous to spatiotemporal relations, but it's obviously not specified in those terms, it can't be. And then he's got to hook that coordinate system up with the usual physical coordinate system to say how we pair mental causes with physical effects. And without that, we just can't make sense, Kim says, of Descartes' interactionist picture. Okay, so I'm going to leave that there because we really have to move on. That's the pairing problem. Now, I covered this a little bit with all of you last week in the tutorial, so I won't linger on it here. But the reason that we should care still about Cartesian dualism is that, one thing is it's pre-theoretically intuitive. We talked about that last week. It also helps to carve up the conceptual landscape and give us the set of problems to work on. How do these things relate to each other? And we'll see that a lot of the other views we'll look at, like behaviorism today and the other views later, are often specified in terms of how they do better, say, than Cartesian dualism. So that's partly why we need to understand Cartesian dualism in order to even address these other views.